Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi. I'm the treasurer for Columbia, DC, and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. This evening, we are very honored to have Dr. Paul Pillar, a senior fellow for the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University, also a fellow at Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, to talk about his latest book that just came out in paperback from Columbia University Press. The title is Beyond the Water's Edge: How Partisanship Corrupts U.S. Foreign Policy, which is very apt title to discuss. Please allow me to briefly introduce Paul's incredible accomplishment. I do encourage everyone to check our website for his full bio, which includes, in addition to this book, multiple publications, some of them from Columbia University Press that you can reach out and acquire. Paul is a veteran, 28-year veteran of the U.S. intelligence community. His last position was the National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. He had a variety of analytical and managerial positions, including Chief of Analytic Units at the CIA, covering portion of the Near East and the Persian Gulf and South Asia. Dr. Pillar was an inaugural a member of the National Intelligence Council, and he has acted as executive assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence, William Webster. He receives his bachelor's with distinction from Dartmouth and Oxford, and an MA and PhD from Princeton University. I also want to mention that he's a retired officer in the U.S. Army Reserve and served on active duty from 71 to 73, including a tour of duty in Vietnam. So without further ado, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and a pleasure to speak to this forum. I'm going to begin by saying a few things about how I came to write the book that's under discussion and how it fits into some larger intellectual endeavors. You could think of the ideal textbook, ideal way in which U.S. foreign policy should be made as going something like this. The policymakers would learn as much as they could about the situation overseas that they have to deal with, getting the most accurate information and analysis, relying especially on their intelligence agencies, but not exclusively on them, engaging the whole bureaucracy that might have to do with whatever U.S. interests are involved. Options would be prepared, and then the president would make a decision as to what option would best advance U.S. interests. That's the ideal. Unfortunately, there's departure from the ideal more often than we'd like to think of. And after I left government service, three of the books I've written, all of which were published by Columbia University Press, have explored different aspects of how actual U.S. foreign policy departs from the ideal. One of those books, Intelligence and U.S. Foreign Policy, as the title implies, is mainly about the intelligence policy relationship, but it reaches the overall conclusion that if you're looking at what drives the really big decisions in U.S. foreign policy, decisions like going to war or revising grand strategy, it's not something that comes out of the bureaucracy. Rather, it comes mostly from the conceptions and the beliefs and the objectives that policymakers bring with them into office. That book has a lot to say about the decision to go to war against Iraq in 2003, which was a long-held neoconservative ambition. It certainly was not driven by anything that came out of the bureaucracy, and indeed, it was directly against much of what was implied by the output of the intelligence community, including assessments I supervised at the time that painted a rather gloomy picture of what Iraq was likely to look like after the invasion. Now, another source of divergence from the textbook ideal is the way we Americans in general, because of our nation's exceptional situation and history, often tend to misperceive the rest of the world, which has not had the same kind of situation in history. And this was the subject of a book entitled Why America Misunderstands the World. For example, the fact that we have had a social structure and social history much different, even from European countries, let alone the rest of the world, has enabled us to enjoy, at least up until now, a fairly stable liberal democracy. And that fortunate situation tends to carry with it a tendency to think that the ingredients of a stable liberal democracy can fall into place just as easily in other countries. And I would suggest that that was another factor in addition to wishful neoconservative thinking that lay behind the support for the Iraq War. A third source of divergence is the book under discussion, which is the intense partisanship that has infected so much of American social and political life, including domestic matters and not just foreign policy. The subtitle refers to corruption of foreign policy, and I use that term advisedly and carefully, even though we think of corruption mainly about some crook in City Hall who takes bribes. But really, in a more general sense, corruption means acting on behalf of some interest other than the public or national interest on behalf of which officials are supposed to be acting. And when we're talking about partisanship, that other interest involved is the interest of a political party in gaining or maintaining power, which is different from the national interest. This is actually a rather narrow definition of ills that one might associate partisan attitudes with when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, there might be positions associated with one major party and not the other, maybe something having to do with race or abortion or what have you, that gets applied to foreign relations in ways that you or I might assess make for bad foreign policy. But if the policymakers apply them not primarily to advance the power of a political party, but instead because they genuinely believe, even if mistakenly, that what they are doing makes the world a better place and advances U.S. interests. If that's the case, it's not corruption in the way that I'm using that term. For political parties to be thoroughly involved in making and discussing foreign policy is not per se bad. Parties perform the important functions of aggregating and articulating interest in debates about foreign as well as domestic policy. If our two parties disagree about something in foreign policy, it can be for any of three general reasons, two of which are quite legitimate parts of policy debate in a democracy, and one of which is not. One of the reasons, possible reasons, is that their political bases tend to have different interests that can be affected by foreign policy decisions. This particularly is the case with economic and trade issues. A tariff, for example, always is going to have some winners and some losers. And so if that divide tends to be somewhat congruent with party divisions, that may show up as different party policies regarding the issue at hand. Another possible reason for difference is ideology, or in a closely related topic when it comes to foreign policy, grand strategy, overall approaches about how the United States ought to conduct itself in an anarchy world. We have debates, for example, about how we should think about China. Should it be regarded mainly as a military competitor or as an economic competitor or as a necessary partner in addressing global issues? Those sorts of debates can generate, different points of view, which may be reflected in party positions, but it's a useful debate that, if it works well, can end up with, the best possible policy, all things considered, about China. The third and the one possible reason for divergence that is not a legitimate part of a healthy democratic process is partisan corruption, as I've defined it. Now, many and perhaps most instances in which partisan corruption is in play involves the parties taking different positions, and I'll be citing some examples. But it can also be involved when they take the same position, and this occurs when parties determine their position based on what they believe in the short run will win them more votes than they will lose from the electorate, even if they have good reason to believe that in the long run, the policy they are advocating is bad for the national interest. This most often arises in taking a militant position in the face of some perceived foreign threat. Politicians usually have been much more fearful about losing votes because they are seen as too soft in the face of such a threat rather than being too hard, or at least until perhaps an unsuccessful war has gone long enough to swing public opinion in the opposite direction. For example, when the United States entered the Vietnam War in the 1960s, there was much private pessimism about U.S. officials, as documented in the Pentagon Papers, about how this expedition would turn out. And yet there was an imperative to do it anyway, partly for reasons having to do with the perception that U.S. credibility was on the line, but also partly for rather crass domestic political reasons. John Kennedy was quoted as telling a journalist friend, and I quote, "We don't have a prayer prevailing in Vietnam, but I can't give up a piece of territory like that to the communists and then get the American people to reelect me," unquote. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, who was running against the Republican Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election, said to his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 64, that people calling him, quote, "want to be damn sure I don't pull him out and run. That's what all the country wants because Goldwater is raising so much hell about he's going to blow him off the moon," unquote. Partisan motivations also were involved in the launching of the Iraq War in 2003, in addition to the other considerations that I already mentioned. When Congress voted on the war resolution in late 2002, you had on the Republican side party loyalty taking preference over what were some serious doubts that many Republican members had about this coming military expedition. One such member was the House Republican leader, Richard Armey, who, after he got a briefing from Vice President Cheney, later said, quote, "If I'd gotten the same briefing from President Clinton or Al Gore, I probably would have said, ah, bullshit. But you don't do that to your own people," unquote. On the Democratic side, you had a variation of this phenomenon I already mentioned of being afraid of being perceived as too soft in the face of a foreign threat. Many of the Democratic members regretted having voted against the 1991 war against Iraq. That was Operation Desert Storm, the reversal of Iraq's seizure of Kuwait. A war that turned out to be a short, smashing victory for the US-led coalition and thus turned out to be popular. Democrats noted that the only members of their party who had been on national tickets in the last three presidential elections before 2002, namely Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and Joe Lieberman, had been in their party's minority in supporting that 1991 military effort. And so this time, even though a majority of the Democrats in the House voted against the 2002 war resolution, a majority of Democrats in the Senate, which is where most of the presidential aspirants, people like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton were, voted in favor of the war. Partisanship has corrupted U.S. foreign policy to different degrees throughout U.S. history, and the book recounts much of that. I'm not going to retrace the whole history, but I want to note that one of the most intensely partisan periods was during the first quarter century of the Republic, in which the division was between the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. That partisan divide got so intense that, as Jefferson put it in a letter he wrote in 1797, and I quote, "Men who have been intimate all their lives cross the streets to avoid meeting and turn their heads another way, lest they should be obliged to touch their hat," unquote. There was a big foreign policy element in that particular partisan divide. The biggest foreign policy challenges by far to the US at the time involved relations with the two European powers, Britain and France. And at the risk of oversimplification, the Hamiltonians tended to be pro-British and the Jeffersonians were pro-French. Much of this was a projection of the kind of society that each party wanted to see in the US, and there was also partly different reactions to what was going on in the French Revolution, rather than the result of any carefully thought out grand strategy about the best way for the young republic to survive in a world dominated by major European powers. Partisan corruption entered into this as well, such as when Hamilton took steps to exacerbate problems with France in the expectation that this would make the Jeffersonians look bad and would cost them votes at the next election. In modern times, probably the most admirable period of bipartisan cooperation on important issues of foreign policy began during World War II, when Franklin Roosevelt appointed prominent Republicans to what became, in effect, a bipartisan war cabinet, and in which his Republican opponents in two presidential elections, Wendell Willkie in 1940 and Thomas Dewey in 1944, provided important political support to the war effort, and each one passed up opportunities to score political points against Roosevelt that might have helped them avoid defeat. This cooperation extended into the early Cold War years, in which the most prominent Republican voice on foreign policy, Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, functioned almost as a co-secretary of state in working closely with the Truman administration on such initiatives as the writing of the UN Charter, enactment of the Marshall Plan, and creation of NATO. Now, certainly during the Cold War, there were, in contrast, instances of partisan corruption, including a couple of instances I'll mention of the most egregious form of it, namely sabotaging US foreign policy to try to win an election. In 1968, the election was between the Republican Richard Nixon and the Democrat Hubert Humphrey, the vice president under Johnson. Nixon feared that if the Johnson administration had succeeded in reaching a peace agreement in the Vietnam War, which was at its height at that point, then Humphrey probably would have won. And so Nixon used his contacts with the South Vietnamese regime to get South Vietnamese President Tu to balk at any cooperation with regard to negotiating a peace. And as we know, the war continued for over another 4 years. 12 years later, in 1980, it was Jimmy Carter against Ronald Reagan. And the Reagan campaign was convinced that if Jimmy Carter could reach an agreement with Iran to release the American hostages who had been seized the previous November, then Carter would win the election. And to prevent that, the campaign chairman of the Reagan campaign, William Casey, reached out through his business contacts to the Iranian regime and reached a secret deal with the Iranians that would ensure the hostages would continue to be imprisoned until after the election, in return for which the incoming Republican administration would be cooperative with the Iranians in seeing that they were able to get arms shipments that they would use in the war that Iraq started against them in September of 1980. But it's during the last 30 years or so that the problem of partisan corruption has intensified so much that a difference of degree has in effect become a difference in kind, with compatriots on the other side of the partisan divide being considered as enemies every bit as much as, if not more than, foreign enemies. Not by everyone, but by a lot of people. There are a number of reasons for this, but I would point to three, one of which is specifically about foreign relations and the other two about partisanship in general. One reason was the end of the Cold War. You had for 4 decades prior to the early 1990s, Soviet communism as a kind of lodestar that was always out there as the major adversary, and against which everyone realized the United States had to unite to a large degree to confront. Then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was no longer the case. And so without the prominent external enemy, the internal divisions had more room to come out and to become a major factor in US policy. A second reason is the political revolution that was engineered by Newt Gingrich, former congressman from Georgia, who preached the message to his fellow Republicans that if they were to avoid perpetual minority status, they had to direct everything they do, every vote they cast, every speech they make, not toward the national interest, but instead toward the objective of gaining and maintaining power for the Republican Party. Gingrich liked to quote Mao Zedong when he said, "Politics is an extension of war." The 1994 midterm election was Gingrich's big triumph. Republicans won majorities in both the House and the Senate. It made Gingrich the Speaker of the House, and it made his fellow Republicans hooked on his hardball methods of politics as war and devoting everything to the power of the party. The third factor I would mention is the fractionization, or you might call it the siloization of sources of information and ideas. Long gone is the day when most Americans might watch Walter Cronkite and what he had to say in reporting about Vietnam and then debate about what to do in the face of the facts that he was reporting. In the last 30 years or so, it's been a much more a matter of people listening to broadcasts with a partisan slant. Fox News, for example, started broadcasting in 1996. It was also a period when right-wing talk radio was really in its heyday. And then later, social media, which are even more fractionated, if anything, along partisan and ideological lines. So no longer do we have just disagreement about what to do in the face of facts, but disagreement even about the facts. And now in the post-truth age of Donald Trump, we've reached the extreme in which truth doesn't seem to matter at all, and many partisans will readily believe outright lies as long as it comes from someone in their own party. The prevailing view found these days most explicitly on the right of people on the other side of the political divide was perhaps illustrated by an anonymous Republican congressman who was reacting to something negative that the Iranian regime had said about Donald Trump. And the member in response said that they, the Iranians, are, quote, almost as bad as the Democrats, unquote. Well, when you have someone describing a foreign regime that is generally considered an adversary of the United States as only almost as bad as members of the other American political party, you see what I mean in terms of the how perspectives have changed. This, by the way, is a rejection of the posture of Ronald Reagan, who, when he heard his aides making hot-headed and very caustic comments about Democrats, would admonish them by saying, remember, domestically, we don't have enemies, we have just opponents. One of the most frequent manifestations of partisan corruption of policy in the current era is opposition for the sake of opposition, opposing a policy coming from someone in the other party just because it is from the other party, in order to distinguish one's own side, to have an issue for criticizing the other side, and to deny the other side an accomplishment. This characterized the response of Republicans in Congress to a number of foreign policy measures during Barack Obama's administration, but probably the leading example was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal, which was generally seen as Obama's biggest foreign policy accomplishment. And so politically, it played somewhat the same role as the Affordable Care Act did, which was seen as his biggest domestic accomplishment. So the Republican perspective was, we need to kill the ACA domestically, and we need to kill the Iran nuclear deal in foreign policy because each one was a major accomplishment of the other side. This continued to be the case in Republican opposition to any idea of restoring the JCPOA during the presidency of Joe Biden, which in a way was even more remarkable given that enough time had gone by to demonstrate how much of a failure the maximum pressure policy initiated by Donald Trump when he reneged on the deal in 2018 had been. The main failure being that Iran embarked on a major increase in its nuclear program, which led to the events we saw earlier this year, a war initiated by Israel that later dragged in the United States. Now, the book was written before the start of Trump's second term, and so most of its observations about Trump are based on his first term. Trump's motives and objectives are plainly narrowly self-centered, having to do largely with himself, his ego, his pocketbook, his personal power, and his personal sense of revenge. But his capture of the Republican Party has been so complete for the most part that any corruption of foreign policy based on Trump's personal motives is in effect another instance of partisanship corrupting. There were certainly ample instances during Trump's first term of opposition for the sake of opposition, with the closest thing to a general operating principle, if one can call it that, being that he would do the opposite of whatever Obama and the Democrats did. His reneging on the JCPOA, even though up until his reneging on it, the Iranians had scrupulously observed all of the limits in the agreement for 3 years, was probably the leading example. There were also examples in trade, as withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because that was something that came out during a Democratic administration, and his withdrawal from the North American Free Trade Agreement, describing it as one of the worst deals ever, which he did replace, in this case, with another North American trade agreement that, even though it involved fairly minor changes from NAFTA, he described as one of the best deals ever. Although in his second term, as you know, he has in effect junked his own deal with the trade war he's waged against Mexico and even more so against Canada. Trump's handling of what may have been the most serious challenge of his first term, the COVID pandemic, was one in which he first tried to downplay the seriousness of the situation, and then when it became too serious to continue to downplay, he shifted his tactic to one of blaming China for everything. And thus, a big chunk of U.S. foreign policy, that is, policy toward another major great power, China, became to a large degree a function of an effort to contain negative domestic political fallout about a pandemic. What was perhaps the leading example in his first term of corrupting foreign policy for the narrowest of partisan political motives became the subject of his first impeachment. That is to say, his manipulation or threat to manipulate security assistance to Ukraine in an effort to get the Ukrainians to dig up dirt on his domestic political opponent, Joe Biden. Some of the motives, even openly declared motives, behind Trump's current imposition of tariffs have been equally narrowly partisan. And I think of his slapping high tariffs on Brazil, not for any reason having to do with the economic well-being of Americans, and be prepared to pay more for your coffee, but instead because Trump doesn't like the fact that in Brazil, unlike in the United States, a former president, namely Jair Bolsonaro, who lost an election and then tried to overturn the election result and cling to power illegally, is being held accountable for his crimes. There's another dimension that has been prominent since Trump has been in power that is a topic that I address in a separate chapter in the book, which is the exploitation by foreign regimes of partisan divisions within the United States. This was a major concern of the Founding Fathers, who had experienced much meddling and exploitation during the early years of the Republic by Britain and France, going back even to French meddling in the Continental Congress during the early years of the Revolutionary War. Several of the first installments of the Federalist Paper addressed this very topic. John Jay, who had managed foreign relations under the Articles of Confederation, wrote in one of those essays about how foreign countries, quote, acting under the impulse of opposite interests and unfriendly passions, unquote, would often favor different sides in American domestic politics. Those sides would then, according to Jay, come to favor alliance with a foreign country in giving them help to oppose domestic political rivals, rather than uniting with those domestic compatriots to face whatever threats the foreign countries posed. The same concern was expressed in George Washington's farewell address, in which he warned about how partisan passions can lead to foreign influence and corruption. One indication of partisan corruption at work is when a party starts taking positions contrary to what its history and ideology would suggest. In this regard, Republican positions on a couple of issues are noteworthy. One is trade, where in most modern times, Republicans have usually been at least as much in favor of free trade as Democrats, but now they're overwhelmingly falling in line behind Trump on tariffs and his trade war. Another big illustrative issue is Republican positions toward Russia. Traditionally, the Republican Party has prided itself in standing tall against Moscow, going back through the entire Cold War period when we're talking about the Soviet Union. But under Trump, the Republican posture has changed quickly and markedly in ways reflected not just in leadership policies, but also in opinion polls of rank and file, self-identified Republicans. There are a couple of dynamics at work here. One is a view of Putin's Russian regime as anti-woke. And in effect, this is an extension of domestic culture wars. Putin himself has exploited this to the hilt, making speeches about supposedly sharing Christian values with some in the West in opposition to the woke parts of the West. But the other dynamic is simple political tribalism and the idea of following the party's leader. And so this change in the Republican perspective toward Russia derives from Donald Trump's unusual and still never adequately investigated relationship with Russia. This relationship involves dependencies that certainly include Russia's help in getting him elected in 2016 and may extend to other things, including commercial interests. But as I say, it hasn't ever been adequately investigated. Whatever the full extent of the underlying reasons, and I expect authoritarian envy of Putin as part of it, the highlights of Trump's posture have included openly believing Putin more than he believes U.S. intelligence, and Trump saying 2 days before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2002 that Putin was a, quote, genius, in which Trump lauded his smart move in deploying a so-called peace force to the border with Ukraine. Whatever was the original mix of Russia's motives in interfering in U.S. elections, and notwithstanding Trump's more recent expressions of impatience about Moscow continuing to prosecute the war in Ukraine, the Russian regime undoubtedly sees its investment in Trump as having paid off. The foreign state that for much longer has interfered in U.S. politics more than any other is Israel. And for many years, the strategy of Israel and its U.S. supporters was to seek support across the political spectrum in both parties. But in recent years, that has changed greatly. Although one still sees, perhaps best personified by Joe Biden, the traditional pro-Zionist strain in the Democratic Party, issues involving Israel now show views dividing much more sharply along party lines than they did just a few years ago. And I see two major reasons for this. One is the evolution of the political base of the Republican Party with the increased role of Christian evangelicals, many of whom have dispensationalist theological reasons for supporting whatever Israel does. And the other major reason is the movement of Israeli politics and governments ever farther to the extreme right. So now there is nothing less than a full-scale transnational alliance between the Republican Party in the United States and the Likud Party in Israel, extending even to shared campaign materials and shared sources of financing. And we are thus seeing some of the consequences of the pathological dynamic that John Jay described in the Federalist Papers. This has included such spectacles as a Republican majority in Congress during the Obama administration inviting the head of a foreign government, namely Netanyahu, to denounce from the podium of the U.S. House of Representatives policies of the U.S. government. And that's in addition to all the unrequited gifts, unrequited in the sense of U.S. interest, that Trump gave to the Netanyahu government during his first term, such as the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights. The horrors that have been taking place in the Gaza Strip during the past 2 years have accentuated the partisan divide on matters involving Israel. A Gallup poll that was released just a couple of weeks ago showed that divide to be wider than ever. Respondents, when they were asked about Israeli military actions in Gaza, only 25% of independents and 8% of Democrats expressed approval, both all-time lows and representing significant drops over the past 21 months. In contrast, 71% of Republicans expressed support, which involved no drop at all over the same period. Thus, U.S. policy and policy debates about this troubled part of the world are far from straightforward efforts to advance U.S. interest or security and peace in the Middle East. Instead, this whole set of issues is deeply mired in partisan politics, along with messy religious and cultural overtones. The overall costs of partisan corruption of U.S. foreign policy are difficult to assess completely, but I would say are immense. Probably none of the foreign wars of the 19th century against Britain, against Mexico, and against Spain would have been fought if partisan competition somehow could have been eliminated from the discussions and debate that preceded the decisions to go to war. And in the book, I retrace much of that history. Without the bitter partisan hatred between the Democrat Woodrow Wilson and Republican congressional leaders after World War I, the United States probably would not have rejected the Versailles Treaty and remained out of the League of Nations, with all of the untoward effects that that absence would have over the subsequent 20-year crisis. Without William Casey's election-driven caper with Iran in 1980, 52 American hostages being held under very trying conditions, almost certainly would have been released sooner. And a whole host of policies over the past 3 decades dealing with Russia, China, the Middle East, and other areas have been much farther away from that policy-making ideal than they would have been, to the detriment of U.S. national interest because of the effects of partisan politics. In addition, the oscillation in U.S. policies and the phenomenon of opposition for the sake of opposition that has seen one party undo what the other party did after there's been a change of administrations has lowered credibility and trust in the United States, and thus made it harder to reach new agreements with other nations. For example, this is a problem in trying to negotiate any kind of new nuclear agreement with Iran, because after Trump reneged on the earlier agreement, despite Iran complying with its terms, the Iranians ever since have been demanding that any new agreement must contain some sort of guarantee that the same thing wouldn't happen again. It's hard to imagine exactly what form that guarantee might take, but it's unsurprising that that is an Iranian demand. Added to that is the discounting by foreign governments of much of what the US administrations say and do internationally, because they realize it has more to do with domestic American politics than anything else. I mean, for example, the annual vote in the UN General Assembly about sustaining the embargo of Cuba is one in which the United States is virtually alone except for Israel. And all those other countries realize this isn't mostly anymore about what's going on in Cuba. It's about American domestic politics and Cuban-American votes in Florida and that sort of thing. When Trump addressed the UN General Assembly in 2018, he included in his speech a very partisan boast that his administration has accomplished more than any other in US history. The response of the delegates in the hall was open laughter. I mean, this was an instance of an insertion of partisan puffery into an international statement, making the United States, as personified by the US president on the podium at the UN, becoming literally a laughingstock. And finally, I mentioned misconceptions by the American public on many foreign matters because they're being basically deluged with partisan propaganda. This includes misconceptions about Russia is what it is or is not doing, such as interfering in elections, or the mistaken view, which is very widespread, especially among Republicans, as indicated by opinion polls, that in the Middle East, the mistaken belief that Israel does not have nuclear weapons, but Iran does. It's hard to have a useful debate about policy among people who are so mistaken about basic facts, such as who has nuclear weapons and who doesn't. The book ends on a pessimistic note with some comments about some things that could be done to reduce the intensity of current partisanship, such as changes in electoral systems. But I also make the observation that nobody should hold their breath about any of these remedies being implemented, because there are always partisan interests at stake that have an interest in not seeing those remedies implemented. I'll close by referring back to that earlier period of intense partisanship during the first decades of the Republic. That partisanship was overcome. It was followed by what became known as the era of good feelings during the decade or so after the War of 1812. This was the most harmonious and least partisan period in American history. And if we reflect on why and how that partisanship was overcome, I'm afraid that leads to more pessimism about why the current partisanship is unlikely to lead to a repeat of that happy development. One difference between then and now is that even though the likes of Hamilton and Jefferson sometimes acted as intense partisans, partisanship itself back then was a dirty word. Jefferson once wrote in a letter, quote, "If I could not go to heaven but with a political party, I would decline to go," unquote. And Hamilton provided much of the material to Washington for his farewell address, including that warning about partisan passions leading to foreign influence and corruption. It was recognized by both sides back then that partisanship is bad for the country and bad per se, quite a contrast with the Gingrichian view of placing the party above everything else. Another factor was that during that earlier time, it was widely recognized just how fragile the still young American experiment in representative democracy was. This was still the Revolutionary War generation, which had taken great personal risks and made sacrifices to achieve American independence. James Monroe, the president during the era of good feelings, and himself a Revolutionary War veteran who endured winter at Valley Forge and was wounded at the Battle of Trenton, made national unity a declared prime objective in his first inaugural address, in which he said, and I quote, "The American people have encountered together great dangers and sustained severe trials with success. They constitute one great family with a common interest. Experience has enlightened us on some questions of essential importance to the country," unquote. We simply don't have anything comparable right now to that experience in the Revolutionary War period. And a third factor I would mention related to all this was the quality of the leadership with which this country was somehow blessed during that early period, including, among others, people like Monroe with his unifying political skills, George Washington, who somehow was able to hold things together despite having such bitter political adversaries as Hamilton and Jefferson in the same cabinet, and Washington's successor, John Adams, who went against the prevailing opinion in his own Federalist Party in deciding not to go to war against France in the late 1790s. A statesmanlike decision on his part that because it went against his own party and because the powers in the party, Hamilton and some of his followers, then in effect disowned Adams as a candidate, this probably cost Adams a victory in the presidential election of 1800 when he lost to Jefferson. The contrast with leadership we have now is too great to require any further comment. And with that, I will close and look forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so we already have a bunch of questions coming in. And if you do have any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A function and I can read them out loud. So we had a question pretty early on that I think kind of picks up from where you finished off your talking points. And somebody says, wants to know what you think about the premise that the main issue about U.S. foreign policy is that the average American doesn't care or have enough knowledge to have civil engagement in it, which really leaves it to the lobbyists to dictate or, I guess, fund politicians who then make the calls.
Yes, that's a big factor. And in the book, I present some of the documentary evidence about how, to put it bluntly, how ignorant most Americans are about foreign relations. I mean, you're not even being able to, identify Iraq on a map and that's sort of, basic things. So that leaves the field open, not just to the actions by party leaders and lobbyists, but also makes it fertile ground for what I was talking about in perpetuating outright falsehoods and misconceptions about things, if it is perceived as serving a party purpose. So yes, absolutely, that's a big part of it. The American public has always been notoriously episodic at best with regard to its interest in foreign relations. When you have a crisis, or especially when you have a sustained war, something like the Vietnam War with casualties that cannot be ignored, then that becomes a prominent issue. But most of the time, that's not the case. And I would certainly agree with the premise of the question.
Great. And I realized I dove right in. I didn't even introduce myself. But my name is Miyako Yurik, and I'm the admin for ColumbiaDC. I actually studied history at Columbia in undergrad, 20th century foreign policy. So really enjoyed the discussion. I went to grad school after that in global policy studies. And one of the topics that we studied there was really how domestic politics does vary back and forth between the parties. But, and this is over a decade now, but they were saying that foreign policy had tended to be more consistent across parties. But that seemed kind of contrary to what you were saying. So I was hoping you could kind of go into that a little bit.
Yeah, in fact, there was some commentary, I quote some of this in the book, if you go back before these last 30 years, uh, to the effect that, yeah, there has been continuity, which some of the commentators didn't like, but most do. Uh, and but that's part of what's changed. And even though you still have people, like Ben Rhodes, who talk about the blob, meaning, this sort of cross-party foreign policy establishment that has certain common traditional views about that thing. I would say over these last 30 years or so, this period that I say has been one in which partisanship has been a much bigger factor in U.S. foreign policy. That has become much less the case. Um, and so my short answer would be yes, that used to be true. And the idea of a foreign policy establishment of one sort or another that provided continuity certainly used to be the case. Uh, I talked about Roosevelt during World War II and bringing prominent Republicans in. That was really the traditional foreign policy establishment in which the likes of somebody like a Henry Stimson, who was a Republican, or a Dean Acheson as a Democrat, were still part of the same um, experienced, respected establishment that went between Wall Street law firms and U.S. government positions. Again, that's no longer the case. And if we just look at appointments of the current administration, we're talking about something far, far different from the way it was even just 30 years ago.
Definitely. Okay, so we had another question pretty early on in your talk. And the question is, U.S. electoral system, especially on the GOP side, seem to encourage short-term gains rather than long-term strategic approach to solve problems, including foreign policy. Do you agree with this? And do you think on the Democratic side too, are they doing the same thing and just messaging it better?
Yes, in the concluding chapter, I've got a whole section about electoral systems and how it would be so much better if we changed our traditional system of first past the post elections and party primaries. Well, recognizing that I'm not going to hold my breath that that'll happen because, again, you have existing interests that are going to fight that. Sure, we have a system now where with overwhelmingly safe districts in the House of Representatives. Um, the election that matters most is the primary. And so it's a competition for the party base rather than for voters in general. And that has accentuated the polarization, and the polarization has become related to the inclination to see the other side as so far out that they are enemies every bit as much as foreign enemies are. It would be far, far better to have, well, there are a number of systems you could go to, but like something like Alaska has experimented with a combination of ranked choice voting and open primaries, which would totally change, the incentives for candidates in terms of whom they're appealing to. They'd have to appeal to the center. They would have to find ways to bridge partisan gaps rather than it being a contest to who is going to be most responsive to the hotheads inside one party or the other. And I would apply this to both parties. Uh, there have been a few states, I mentioned Alaska, some others that, California has had some open primaries, and I think it's all for the good. I would be all in favor of making that sort of thing nationwide. There's no question the electoral system has a huge amount to do with it, and if good citizens can push for those sorts of things, I applaud the effort.
That's super interesting. I know the ranked choice voting is a really big topic right now, the New York race that just happened, and kind of open primaries, but I hadn't considered the two together. So there was a question where somebody was asking if there's any way forward to reach that bipartisan approach, reaching across the aisle, and maybe kind of the combination of those two might force people to kind of come more to the center where they could be more bipartisan.
Yeah, I think what Alaska does is an open primary, then they take like the top four, and it then becomes ranked choice voting with those four. It's something like that. They're different variations, but as long as we got away from the party as being the prime division, uh, then that would help counteract most of the patterns I'm talking about.
Mm. So we have a question. Somebody says they worked overseas for many years and noticed the great disconnect between what was actually going on in the ground in certain countries and what many in DC believed was the situation. And people in DC seem to be brainwashed by lobbyists for foreign countries in the States. Is there any way we can limit the influence of foreign country lobbies in the US?
Well, of course, we do have a Foreign Agents Registration Act in which there's at least supposed to be transparency, in which if there's any lobbying by anyone associated by a foreign government, we're at least supposed to know about it because it'd be registered with the Department of Justice. This has not been uniformly enforced. I mean, all the lobbyists who work on behalf of the State of Israel have never been forced to register under FARA. That's probably the most glaring example. But then you also have the issue of, well, the kinds of things that the Russians were doing in the 2016 election. I mean, this isn't formal lobbying, but it's certainly influencing elections or an effort to influence elections. And I think there again, transparency and a declared willingness to recognize this is an important problem and we ought to fight it. Unfortunately, with the whole, Russia-Trump thing, it's not getting fought. And in fact, ever since the U.S. intelligence community, reached its judgment way back in 2017 that indeed, the Russians had done a number of things to intercede in the 2016 election, partly just to discredit American democracy, but partly to aid Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. And that finding has been repeatedly confirmed by Robert Mueller's investigation, and even more at even greater length by the bipartisan report that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence later came out with. I mean, there's no doubt that it happened. But ever since then, Mr. Trump and his supporters have spared no effort to try to discredit, any mention of this kind of interference, especially any mention in which Trump's name comes up. And in fact, we've seen an acceleration of this just over the last few weeks of efforts that have ranged from they've ranged from the scurrilous to the ridiculous. With, for example, Tulsi Gabbard, alleging all kinds of misconduct based on a blatant lie about what the intelligence community actually said back in 2017 and asserting that the judgment said things that they never said. And then you had most recently, I think this was just in the past week, there was some kind of disclosure of something that was in the appendix of the report that John Durham in his inquiry made. Now remember, the Durham inquiry was something that Bill Barr, in the Attorney General in the first Trump administration, set up with the express purpose of trying to find some sort of political motive in the FBI and the intelligence community for investigating this whole Russia thing. Durham had an investigation that lasted for something like 3 years and cost $6 million, and he came up empty. He couldn't find anything. And he was reduced to prosecuting a couple of individuals for allegedly lying against to the FBI, and they were both acquitted. And this most recent thing was something that Durham had buried in an appendix, which have been mentioned by the Trump supporters. Oh, this is more evidence of this hoax and this conspiracy. In fact, it was the exact opposite. The main item in this appendix was that this supposedly bombshell email that linked the Clinton campaign to an effort to perpetuate a hoax about Trump and Russia was itself a Russian fabrication. As Durham evidently reluctantly had to concede. And so it was yet another example of Russian interference in trying to discredit Clinton. So with that kind of effort, on vigorous effort on the Republican side, it's hard to have much confidence that we're going to take this seriously, this idea of having to combat foreign interference, take it as seriously as the founding fathers did and everything I quoted, from John Jay and George Washington. I would note this is yet another thing that has changed just in the last 2 or 3 decades. If you go back a little bit before that, both parties recognized the ill of foreign interference in our elections. Back in the 1992 election, which was George H.W. Bush versus Bill Clinton, Mr. Bush and his campaign chairman uh, that were given the uh, idea from someone, I can't remember who it came from, that they ought to mine some sources in Britain to try to find dirt on Bill Clinton based on when he was a student there and was involved in some protests against the Vietnam War. And maybe portray him as being unpatriotic. And Bush and Jim Baker, his campaign chairman, immediately said, "We're not going there. Forget it. We're not going to try to use foreign sources to dig up dirt on our opponent." Then in the 2000 election, Al Gore against George W. Bush, there was something that came up about a possible Chinese financial contribution that might have helped the Gore campaign. And when this came up, both Gore and President Clinton were immediately cooperative. They said, yes, it ought to be fully investigated. They provided all the documents and information that they could to the investigators to run this to ground. Big difference from the whole hoax witch hunt thing that we've heard with regard to the Trump-Russia business.
The foreign influence in the elections has definitely come up a lot, obviously just in the past year with the election. But it's not just Russia. There are a lot of other countries that work to influence the US in various ways. So we have a question on if China is able to influence American foreign policy, and what might happen should they choose to try and invade Taiwan. What kind of influence might they be trying to do here for that type of scenario?
Well, first of all, I haven't delved in it in detail in terms of what are the most recent things the Chinese are doing, but from my understanding, they seem to be mostly not the sorts of things that the Russians were doing with regard to, say, the 2016 election, but much more indirect, but very numerous efforts to influence opinion in the United States. And this, through students, through, business contacts, through Confucius societies and that sort of thing. It appears that China is very, very serious about trying to use a lot of different channels of influence, but it's not so much trying to sabotage somebody's election campaign, but more just using all the indirect ways of trying to push American opinion in a direction that's more favorable to China. So that's a huge dimension that goes far beyond election interference, and far beyond sort of formal lobbying of the sort that would be registered under FARA. And I think it is a big concern. And I think again, transparency is the best way to at least initially to address it and to make it a matter for Congress and the administration to be fully aware of everything that the Chinese are attempting to do in this regard.
Mm-hmm. I think that AI is definitely playing it has a big impact in this space for foreign countries. It used to be very obvious when foreign countries would try and put out news media or press or propaganda, you could tell just the language wasn't always as good. But now with AI, I feel like they can use these tools and the natural language models to make it a lot easier to influence on social medias and different kind of campaigns to reach a lot of people.
I would agree.
Okay, so we had a question on the long-term impact of this current administration's approach to foreign policy. They've put in a lot of new people. They're kind of breaking new norms. So kind of given what's happening now, looking forward, what do you think kind of the long-term impact will be? And will the U.S. recover?
Well, huge question that actually goes far beyond our current topic. I think we could expound on this for some time. I think there are so many things that will be very difficult to be rebuilt I mean, just like, dismantling the Voice of America and dismantling USAID. I mean, you can't, even if you had, say, a Democrat elected in the next presidential election in 2028, that person, even working with a congressional majority, is not going to be able to restore anything like things were just, 7 months ago. I mean, think of the media business, the Voice of America. You lose listenership. You don't just get it back immediately. You lose it to other countries and other outlets, and some of that's never going to come back. But to narrow the question down, sort of take it back to more of the topic I was talking about. I think it's the damage to U.S. trustworthiness and credibility with regard to making agreements and making commitments, or making agreements where the other side has to make some sort of commitment in the belief that the United States is going to come through on its commitments. That has sustained severe damage. And no matter what kind of welcome message the next president of whichever party may preach to welcome to the ears of foreign governments, the thinking in those foreign governments is always going to be, so what assures us that there's not going to be another Donald Trump 4 years from now? And why should we make this commitment on defense spending or this or that or trade or whatever it is if there's just going to be another U.S. reneging? That is going to be very, very hard to repair, because I think even fair-minded observers are going to have difficulty saying, okay, even if we had what we would consider a big political turnaround in the next couple of elections, heads will continue to be shaken in foreign capitals about just how American politics works and how we can't trust it like we once did.
Okay, we still have a few questions coming in. So Len says that he really likes your idea of this political and partisan corruption, and is wondering if you can hear kind of more on the distinction or the similarity with kind of the more common use of corruption that we hear in the financial corruption sense.
Well, again, the way I define it, it's anytime you have an interest other than the public interest that an official is elected or appointed is supposed to be working on behalf of, then it's corruption. I think, I mean, the similarity is, the guy who takes the bribe in City Hall, okay, he is working on behalf of an interest that can be defined as his personal financial interest, which is different from the interest of the citizens of that city. It's it's a different interest than a political party trying to achieve power or win the next election. But it's fundamentally the same in that it is not the public interest of the city or of the nation, whatever the level is we're talking about, that those officials are supposed to pursue. Let me draw a contrast I did in the book, again, looking back just before this period of the last 3 decades or so. One of the most gracious things that a very gracious president, George H.W. Bush, did was the letter he left in the Oval Office desk for his successor, Bill Clinton, who had just beaten him in the 1992 election. And I can't remember the exact wordings I quoted in the book, but it basically said, "You are president now, and I wish you well, because if you succeed, the country succeeds." All right, that is the way it's supposed to work. But on the corruption side, again, whether it's personal financial interest or a political party interest, that's different from what that official or that president is supposed to be working on behalf of.
Okay, we had a question kind of on the difference between the last 2 administrations. So do you see a material difference between the Biden and the Trump foreign policy towards the war in Gaza?
Well, a little bit, but not. I mentioned Joe Biden. I think I mentioned Joe Biden as perhaps the best personification of the old line traditional Democratic pro-Zionist posture. I mean, Biden himself, described himself as a Zionist. And so um, there was certainly a lot of slowness on Biden's part to respond negatively to what Gaza has become over these last 21 months. But I mean, by the end of his term, I think he had eventually got to the point that he realizes this is a disaster, personally, for the people who live there. And Mr. Trump has been much slower to reach that point. I think he's said some things just in the past couple of weeks that suggest he's become more impatient with Netanyahu, particularly with over the starvation issue. And Netanyahu made this incredible comment just a couple of weeks ago, something to the effect that there's no starvation in Gaza, and that was too extreme, even for Trump. But notwithstanding Trump's impatience in seeing Netanyahu in continuing the military operation there as standing between Trump and his hoped for Nobel Peace Prize, the same way in which he now sees he's impatient with Putin in continuing to prosecute the Ukraine war as standing between him and his Nobel Peace Prize. That should not lead us to conclude that what I described as nothing less than a full-blown transnational alliance between the Republicans and the Likud to suggest that that's not still the case. It is. And I don't see any of that changing until and unless opinion in the United States evolves, and much of it has evolved, but it's mainly on the left, of outrage over what's happening in Gaza for Republicans and for Trump to conclude that posture they've had toward Israel is no longer a winning posture. I think we start to see some clues on this with like the Mamdani election in New York City, which as the polls have shown, Mamdani won. He came in first among Jewish New York voters. This is a real turnaround, given what people have tried to accentuate and draw attention to what comments he's made about the Israel-Palestine situation, which of course has been much different from, it's kind of lockstep support for what Israel is doing. But to get back to the short answer to the initial question is, even though Biden did personify the traditional two-party approach to supporting Israel, there's been a significant difference between the last two administrations on this.
Okay, we're getting some more questions. I'm going to try and keep going through them here. Harriet asks, how would you compare the way elected officials represent and respond to the electorate now and during the early 1800s or even 30 years ago?
How do they respond to the electorate? Respond to the electorate. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, we've got much more accurate, and the politicians have much more accurate ways of gauging opinion. And so if they want to play to the crowd, they can do it more accurately than perhaps some of the people in the early 19th century were able to do. I think the basis for the kind of partisanship I've been talking about, particularly when it becomes partisan corruption in the way I've defined it, hasn't really changed that much. You had back in that early Federalist era period that I talked about, an appeal to party bases that was not all that dissimilar from what we see now. I think it's just been more a matter of the tools like polls and like gerrymandering have become much more precise, and so more of the more of the fine tuning to appeal to a particular base is possible now than it once was. I mean, on the gerrymandering thing, for example, you got like the people, the Republicans in Texas who are, drawing their new maps right now. They can use very precise information, down to the individual city block, about how to draw the lines to maximize partisan advantage. And so if you want to play the system in a way that obviously the Republicans are playing it in Texas, uh, which will perpetuate, the kinds of districts where you're going to appeal to your own party's base in as many of those districts as possible. That can be done with greater precision than Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson ever could back in their time. That I think that's the main difference.
So we had a question that says, your examples of partisan corruption of foreign policy in modern times have all involved Republicans. Are there any comparable examples among Democrats? And if not, why?
Yes, there are comparable examples. I addressed this issue really in the introduction to the book, and I got a section in which I quote some of what Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann have written on this when they wrote several years ago. Let's face it, much of this problem with American politics is on the one side, the Republican side. That should not be surprising in that you look at some other research that's been done on such matters as people's loyalty to an in-group versus a larger national community, about the attitudes toward the perceived illegitimacy of someone else's president, or about the tendency to follow partisan sources of news and information. All of those show there's more of that on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. So we shouldn't be surprised about the asymmetry of this, even though my book was written not to make some partisan case, but rather to just explore the whole issue. But are there Democratic examples? Of course there are. Let me cite. Well, I mentioned John Kennedy in connection with the Vietnam War. That's not the only thing we can accuse John Kennedy of with regard to this kind of partisan corruption. There was the so-called missile gap, which played heavily in the 1960 presidential election. Kennedy played that up to the hilt because he saw it as a possible winner. It probably did help him win in what was a very close election. And he continued to play it up even after, he had reason to believe, given classified briefings, that the missile gap did not exist. And in fact, one of the reasons his opponent, Richard Nixon, really had a grudge against the CIA ever after that was that he believed that the CIA had not done enough to, brief Kennedy in a way that would disabuse him of this notion of the missile gap. But I think really what the truth was, Kennedy knew there wasn't a missile gap, but he still tried to exploit the issue because he saw it as a vote winner. I mean, that was blatant corruption, and I think it led to probably bigger defense budgets with regard to strategic arms than would have been necessary or would have been appropriate if this myth hadn't been perpetuated for basically partisan reasons. That was on the Democratic side. And then, of course, in my Vietnam War example, that got to Lyndon Johnson as well. So yes, there's an asymmetry, but we can find this sort of thing on both sides.
Yeah, it definitely obviously gets played up in the media versus how politicians are kind of in person. I've briefed a few senators on the Hill and so smart, ask great questions. They're totally different kind of in a closed door scenario than they are for the media, for the public, trying to make that certain impression. But yeah, it's just a totally different kind of experience when they're one-on-one. Okay, so we have some more questions here from Steven. He asks, what do you foresee the international organizations such as the UN, the IMF, the World Bank looking like at the end of the Trump administration?
Well, there are obviously going to be funding problems, and there will be other problems with staffing and so on because of what some of the things that the Trump administration has done. I mean, for example, in the World Trade Organization, Trump has intentionally not replaced vacancies on the board or committee or whatever it is that arbitrates or adjudicates certain trade disputes. So it can't do its basic job. It just doesn't have the personnel. And the WTO, I think, for that reason alone, has already been in large part eviscerated. I think in sort of in response to that, there will be a lot of efforts from a lot of other governments to use some of the IOs and some of the UN bodies to counteract some of what the U.S. administration under Trump has been doing. Now, when you talk about the UN Security Council, of course, you still got the U.S. veto, so there's not a whole lot you can do there. There probably will be, more use of the UN General Assembly with regard to passing resolutions that might ordinarily be the business of the Security Council, but because of resistance by the permanent members, including the United States, there might be more use of the Assembly. And I think there might be more use of regional and sub-global organizations that don't involve the United States, but are very much international organizations that can do some of the things that might have been otherwise done in cooperation with the U.S. I mean, we're seeing this in trade, for example. I mentioned, all right, Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Well, what happened after that? Well, most of the other countries that were parties to that, then under the leadership of the Japanese, put up a replacement. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's some play on Trans-Pacific Partnership that includes most of the previous TPP members, but without the United States. So they hope to get some of the benefits of trade agreement, even though it doesn't include the U.S. There will be similar efforts with other regional organizations on trade as well as security matters.
We did have a question specifically on trade. They ask if you can expand on international trade and current U.S. approach, which does not seem to be supported by both political parties in general, even if politicians may not be forthcoming publicly.
Well, yeah, privately, there's no question there's a lot of doubts on the Republican as well as the Democratic side, but you've got the phenomenon I've talked about, follow the leader political tribalism. So, I mean, you don't see the Republican majorities in the House and Senate today doing anything that I've been aware of to try to reclaim what under the Constitution is supposed to be the congressional prerogative of determining things like tariffs and regulating trade. I mean, Article 1 of the Constitution is pretty clear on that. And people who have studied this have said, look, much of what Trump has done in trying to, through executive action, impose these tariffs is probably illegal. He's basing it a lot on either a so-called economic emergency, even though, well, at the same time, he's saying the economy is great, or national security grounds as a basis for something like, slapping big tariffs on aluminum from Canada, which, doesn't really make sense from national security grounds. So, there's an international trade court that has already made one or two judgments on this, and this is eventually going to get to the Supreme Court. And of course, all bets are off when you're talking about the Supreme Court majority and presidential powers under Trump. But as far as Congress is concerned, yeah, I think if you could hear the private grumblings of members, many of whom see how some of the tariffs are hurting economically their own constituents. Some of the largely farm districts with Republican representatives that are feeling the effects of some of the retaliatory tariffs by countries that have imported agricultural goods from us, for example. But so far, that has seemed to have less influence than the basic follow the leader political tribalism.
Couple more little questions here, kind of hopefully not taking too long so we can finish up on time. We had somebody ask, do you think the civil service can be restored to its nonpartisan quality in the future now that it has become fully politicized?
This is one of the things that's going to be a huge task. That's going to take a long time. And, again, a new administration of a different party isn't going to be able to do it in a year or 2 years or probably 4 years. No, the damage has been immense on many grounds. You've got, I mean, just kind of removing the political elements that have been inserted is big enough. But think of what this means in terms of recruitment and the willingness of young, talented people to work in public service. I don't teach actively anymore at Georgetown, but when I did, I would advise people in the School of Foreign Service there, many of whom were very much oriented toward working in the national security area for the State Department or the intelligence agencies or what have you. And, if I were advising them now, I mean, I really could not in good conscience say, yeah, this is personally is going to be a good career move for you, because it isn't. And, how much time is it going to take to rebuild the kinds of incentives to lead those sorts of young, talented people to think of public service? And I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's going to take a long time. I mean, I think in terms of both personal perceptions as well as institutional devastation, the damage is immense. This is something we'll talk about, under whatever the next administration is, but it's not going to be a quick fix.
Okay, maybe one last question. It seems that while we've been perpetuating wars, China has quietly been forming alliances, and now we have BRICS. So I won't just limit it to BRICS, but there are a lot of alliances happening. You've mentioned the other trade agreements. So kind of as our partisanship has increased, other countries are kind of forming more of these bipartisan or multi-trade, multi-organizations. How is that going to affect us kind of moving forward?
Well, this goes beyond the partisanship angle. I mean, I think it has at least as much to do with the kind of quasi-isolationist trend that Trump has certainly tried to latch onto and exploit. And you're right. It's, you leave a vacuum, it's going to be filled by somebody else. And the Chinese are doing a very good job with this. Not only with the BRICS mechanism, but things like, I mentioned the, doing away with the Voice of America, basically. Well, that's in terms of public broadcasting and getting a message across. That's another thing that the Chinese can do a lot to fill to their advantage and to our disadvantage. But this really goes beyond the partisanship stuff that I was talking about, and gets to bigger issues of overall, isolationism versus full diplomatic involvement.
Okay, well, I will turn it over to you in just a minute for some closing thoughts, but I do just want to remind everyone some admin notes. We did record this meeting tonight, and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel. So you can either find it on our YouTube, or we will email you out the link tomorrow. And there's also a discount in the email, which you should have received and should be included again, to buy the book. So if you use our code, you'll get a discount on the book that we've been discussing all night. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Professor, for any closing thoughts you might have for us.
I think the only closing comment I would make is one that I made in the preface of the book, which is, I focus on this topic because I'm a foreign relations and international relations guy. That's the stuff I write about. But, the underlying trends that have resulted in the kind of partisanship of foreign policy that I'm discussing are also having, extremely corrosive effects on our institutions and our, political norms here domestically. And, if you ask me personally what I worry about most, it's actually less the stuff that I write about, important though that is in terms of foreign policy, but what's happening to our own democracy here in the United States. And I think, some of the very same trends and attitudes that have underlain what I'm talking about in foreign policy are also badly, badly endangering our democracy at home. So I just want people to know that, you know, what I write about is partly, you know, based on my expertise and experience. It's not necessarily what I'm worrying about the most. I worry most about the life and death of our own democracy right here in the United States.
Well, we're not ending here on an uplifting, positive note, but I think it's good for everybody to continue kind of thinking these thoughts. There's a lot out there. We've had other events, so please continue looking into the topic, reading about it, talking with each other, and we'd love to have you back for your next book.
Okay, thank you. It's been a
All
pleasure.
right. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great night.